Hi guys, this video is for the people who are thinking of buying their first telescope. So before buying your first telescope, you should know what a telescope is and what are its important parts. So I am going to explain everything about all the important components of a telescope, and I will also explain important terms like aperture, focal length, focal ratio. So by the end of this video, you will know everything about a telescope. But before buying your first telescope, one of the most important thing you should keep in mind is the budget. The budget is the most important factor when it comes to buying a telescope. With higher budget, you can definitely get a good quality telescope. The second thing is the size and portability of your telescope. If you buy a big telescope which is heavy and difficult to move around, then most probably you will not use your telescope often and it will be sitting in your home collecting dust. So, size and portability of a telescope is also important. Third thing is, as a beginner, you should know whether do you want to see the planets or do you want to click the images of deep space objects, or maybe you want to do both. This is important because there is not a single telescope which can do it all. If you want to do both, then with some telescopes you can add some accessories and use it for planets and clicking the images of deep space objects as well. But if you're watching this video, that means most probably you are a beginner. So it's better for a beginner to start with planets and gradually add more equipments as you get more interested in the hobby. This is an expensive hobby. So if you're not sure that you will pursue this hobby for long term, then it doesn't make sense to invest a lot of money in the beginning itself. But if you are 100% sure that you will pursue this hobby for long term, then it is worth investing in a good quality telescope right from the beginning. That being said, let's begin. A normal telescope has three main parts. First one is the optical tube, second one is the mount, and third one is the tripod. Based on the optical tubes, these telescopes are classified into three main types. First one is refractor type telescope. Second one is reflector type telescope. The third one is the combination of refractor and reflector type telescopes known as compound type telescopes. The basic reason for this classification is done on the basis of how light behaves inside the optical tube. Now, there are three ways a light behaves when it falls on a glass surface. First, it passes through that glass surface. Second, it gets reflected by the glass surface. And the third is some amount of light passes through the glass surface and some amount of light gets reflected at the same time. This third behavior of light is very inefficient in telescopes. So we will ignore the third behavior and focus on the first two. Now, when light passes through an uneven glass or water, it bends. In physics, this bending of light is called as refraction. If it's a random glass, then the refracted light will not converge or focus at one single point, and you won't be able to see a clear image. That's why you need to polish that glass and make it perfectly smooth so that maximum light passes through that glass surface and get focused on one single point. This polished glass piece, we also call it as a lens. And when a telescope uses lens to collect and focus light, it is known as a refractor telescope. A refractor telescope is your traditional looking telescope which has a long optical tube which sits on a mount, and all of this is placed on a tripod. In refractor telescopes, there is large lens called as objective lens at the front, and at the end of the optical tube there is eyepiece. These refractor telescopes usually are not very big, but a good refractor telescope is going to be very expensive, and a major part of that telescope's cost will come from the lens of that telescope. The second way light behaves when it falls on a surface is that it gets reflected from that surface. This is the reason we see different colors of an object. And when light falls on a mirror reflects 95% of the light which falls on its surface. That's why reflector telescope is the one where light is reflected inside the optical tube. These telescopes primarily use mirrors for reflection of light. Now, for reflection to happen inside the optical tube, you need some space for light to play around. That's why the primary mirror in reflector telescope is at the back of the optical tube. The light falls on this mirror and then it is reflected on the secondary mirror. From there, it is diverted towards eyepiece. The third type of telescope is a compound type telescope, or in scientific terms, you can call it as catadioptric type telescope. This telescope is the combination of reflector and refractor telescope. There are two subtypes of these compound telescope. One is Schmidt-Cassegrain type telescope and another is Maksutov-Cassegrain type telescope. Both these telescopes have different purpose, and I will explain them both later in the video when we talk about focal length. Now we know about the types of telescope, let's talk about the most important part of a telescope. It is its aperture. Aperture simply means the diameter of the main light gathering part of your telescope. In refractor telescopes, it is the lens, and in reflector telescopes, it is the mirror. The aperture of your telescope will decide how much light it will collect. The more light your telescope collects, the sharper and better images you can see of the planets and nearby objects. So it's just common sense that a smaller aperture will collect less light and the views will not be that sharp. On the other hand, bigger aperture will collect more light and the views from that telescope will be sharp and much better. When it comes to refractor telescope, it is very difficult to manufacture big lenses. That's why most refractor telescopes are in a range of about 4 to 5 inches of aperture. But some companies do manufacture 8-inch aperture refractor telescopes, but they will cost you a lot of money, and most importantly, as a beginner, you do not need 8-inch refractor telescope. When it comes to reflector telescopes, manufacturing a mirror is not that expensive compared to lenses. That's why you will find reflector telescopes in the sizes of 12 inches, 14 inches, 16 inches. It can go up to 30 inch of diameter. About compound telescopes aperture, I will talk more about that when we talk about focal length. Now, aperture will make sure that how much light your telescope can collect. But how much of that light travels inside the optical tube before reaching the eyepiece is determined by the focal length. That makes focal length one of the most important parameters of a telescope. A focal length is a distance traveled by light when it enters the optical tube till it exits to the eyepiece. With the focal length, you can determine how much you can zoom in on an object. With longer focal length, you can zoom in more on object and see more details. But a small aperture with longer focal length will not work properly. For example, suppose your telescope has 3 inch of aperture and 3000 mm of focal length. Now your 3 inch aperture cannot collect lot of light, but your 3000 mm focal length will give you a lot of zoom on that object. But because it collects less light, you won't be able to see much detail of that object and mostly you will get blurry views. Also, at the same time, you cannot have a bigger aperture and a small focal length. For example, if your telescope has 10 inches of aperture and only 500 mm of focal length, then you won't be able to see much details of that object or planet. So most telescopes are designed with perfect balance of aperture and focal length. Before the invention of reflector telescopes, astronomers used extremely long tube refractor telescopes. This long tube was to increase the focal length of that telescope so that they can zoom in and see more details of the planets. This was the biggest drawback of refractor telescope at that time. It needed bigger lenses and long tubes just to zoom in on planets and see some details. But this problem of long tube was solved by reflector telescopes. With the invention of reflector telescopes, the focal length can be adjusted in a comparatively small optical tube, and at the same time it supported big aperture. These reflector telescopes did solve the problem of longer focal length. But if you have a big aperture, for example anything above 8 inch or 10 inch, your reflector telescope is still quite big and heavy. This problem is then solved by compound type telescopes. The compound type telescopes made it even easier to fit much longer focal length with bigger aperture in a compact size optical tube. In reflector telescopes, the light is reflected once or twice inside the optical tube. But in compound type telescopes, with the help of lens and mirrors, the light is reflected multiple times even before it reaches the eyepiece. That's why you can get longer focal length with its compact optical tube. Now, there are two types of compound type telescopes. One is Schmidt-Cassegrain type telescope and the second is Maksutov-Cassegrain type telescope. I won't go into much detail about these two telescopes, but a Schmidt-Cassegrain is a versatile and you can see planets, and you can also use it for deep space objects with some accessories. However, Maksutov-Cassegrain telescope is used for planets and nearby objects, but it will give you much sharper and better views of planets and those nearby objects than Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. I have two telescopes. One is Celestron NexStar 8 SE, which has a focal length of 2032 mm, and my smaller telescope is Celestron StarSense 114 LT, and it has a focal length of 1000 mm. The optical tube length of NexStar 8 SE is 432 mm, and the optical tube length of StarSense is 610 mm. Even though the optical tube of NexStar 8 SE is smaller, it still has double the focal length than StarSense. This is because again it is a compound type telescope which can fit longer focal length with big aperture inside a compact tube. The StarSense has an aperture of 4.5 inches and a focal length of 1000 mm. Suppose if we want to increase the focal length of StarSense to 2000 mm and keep everything else same, then your optical tube needs to be above 1200 mm long. This is because it is a reflector telescope. Even though it gives you longer focal length compared to refractors, but with bigger aperture, the size of your optical tube will be longer and heavier. This exact problem was solved by compound type telescopes, which offers you more focal length, big aperture in very compact design. After the focal length, focal ratio is one of the most important parameter of a telescope. Focal ratio will tell you whether your telescope is fast telescope or it is a slow telescope. Now, what I mean by fast telescope and slow telescope. When your telescope collects light faster, then it is known as a fast telescope. When your telescope collects light slower, then it is known as a slow telescope. For beginner, focal ratio and related stuff is not that useful. It is more useful for someone who is doing deep space astrophotography, and I will make a separate video for that. For now, just keep in mind that focal ratio will tell you whether your telescope is fast or slow and how much field of view your telescope will give. Field of view is the area of sky your telescope can see through the eyepiece. If your telescope has a focal ratio below 6, then your telescope is a fast telescope. And if your telescope has a focal length above 6, then your telescope is a slow telescope. A faster telescope is good for deep space astrophotography, and a slower telescope is good for observing the details of the planets and nearby objects in our solar system. This is how the optical tubes of a telescope are. The second most important part of the telescope is the mount. A good stable mount will make sure that you get good views with your telescope. There are two types of mounts. One is altitude azimuth mount and the second is equatorial mount. The AZ mount is simple and it moves up, down and left, right in direction. The equatorial mount is the mount which cancels out Earth's rotation, and it is the best mount you can use. But understanding and using equatorial mount is difficult. That's why absolute beginners should avoid telescopes with equatorial mount. In alt azimuth mount, there is one more subtype of mount which is known as Dobsonian Mount. These mounts are easy to use and has solid fixed base which rotates in left and right direction. And the optical tube sits on this mount which moves in up and down direction. Because of these Dobsonian mounts, there is a whole different category of telescopes known as Dobsonian telescopes. These Dobsonian telescopes have reflector type optical tube. So whenever someone says that they have Dobsonian telescope, it means that their telescope has reflector type optical tube and it has a Dobsonian mount. These Dobsonian telescopes are the best and extremely value for money. No other telescope comes close to these Dobsonian when it comes to value for money. The biggest problem of these Dobsonians is their size and weight. If you have a big aperture Dobsonian telescope, then it will be heavier and less portable. That is the only drawback of these Dobsonian telescopes. Now let's talk about the eyepieces. When you see the details of the telescopes online, you can see that the magnification of that telescope is mentioned. This magnification is created by the eyepieces. If you have never used a telescope, then you should know that the magnification on a telescope does not work like your DSLR or a phone camera where you can zoom in or zoom out by rotating the lens or by tapping 2x or 3x zoom. The magnification on telescopes work differently. You need to use different eyepieces to get different levels of magnification on a telescope. Just like the optical tube of your telescope has a focal length, same way your eyepieces also has a focal length. From that you can get the maximum magnification of your telescope. The simple formula to calculate the magnification is the focal length of a telescope divided by the focal length of the eyepiece. So a telescope with 1000 mm focal length using a 25 mm eyepiece, then it will give you 40 times magnification. On the same telescope, if you use 10 mm eyepiece, then it will give you 100 times magnification. Telescopes usually comes with one or two eyepieces. There are different types of eyepieces. The more you pay for eyepieces, the better quality eyepieces you will get. Now, there are many accessories you can buy for your telescope. But if you are buying a telescope, then one accessory you must have is the Barlow Lens. Barlow Lens will increase the magnification of your telescope. A 2x Barlow lens will double the magnification of your telescope, and a 3x Barlow lens will triple the magnification of your telescope. If a 25mm eyepiece with 1000mm focal length gives you 40 times magnification, then that same setup with adding 2x Barlow lens will give you 80 times magnification. It will be same as using a 12.5mm eyepiece. So if you have 2 eyepieces and 1 Barlow lens, then it is same as having 4 different eyepieces. You should watch this video where I have explained Barlow lens in much more detail. But if you are buying a Barlow lens, then make sure you buy a good quality Barlow lens. Now let's talk about finder scopes or red dot finders. Almost all telescopes come with red dot finder. A red dot finder is a small device which sits on the top of your optical tube. This red dot finder will help you to easily point your telescope at any object. When you use your telescope for the first time, you have to calibrate the red dot finder with your telescope. So whenever you point your red dot finder on any object, that object will be visible through your telescope's eyepiece. Next is the go-to mount, which is also known as computerized mount or the manual mount. Now I have both. My Nexstar 8 SE is a go-to mount and StarSense is a manual mount. With manual mount, you have to find the objects manually, but it will also help you to learn about the night sky. With go-to mount, it is just a computerized mount. You just have to set up your telescope and type any object you want to see, and it will go to that object and start pointing on it. Before we wrap up, let's talk about the expectations of what you will see. Many beginners expect Hubble-like colorful images which you see on Instagram, YouTube, but the reality is different. Through an eyepiece, planets will look smaller, but you can see the details of the Jupiter's bands, details of the craters on the moon, and the rings of Saturn. Most deep space objects will look very faint and like a grayish smudges. But seeing these objects with your own eyes is much better experience than seeing it in my videos or on Instagram or in someone else's YouTube videos. That's why you should definitely own a telescope. And I can guarantee you, eventually you will get addicted to this hobby. Anyways, if you want to know as a beginner which telescope you should buy, then check out these videos. Also, I have covered every single basic concept of telescope in great detail in this playlist. So make sure you watch that playlist. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.